Part 1 of the routine. Evening. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when Chief Justice Robert Hamilton finally left his office. The tall building stood silent, with only a few lights still glowing in the windows. At 62 years old, Robert had seen more courtrooms than most people could imagine. He had spent over 30 years making sure everyone got fair treatment under the law, no matter who they were or where they came from. Tonight felt different somehow. Robert decided to give his security team the night off. They had been working overtime for weeks, and he figured they deserved some rest. Besides, he enjoyed these quiet drives home. It gave him time to think, time to process all the heavy decisions he made every single day. His car was nothing fancy, just a regular dark blue sedan that looked like 1,000 other cars on the road. Robert never liked showing off. He believed that a person's character mattered more than their possessions. As he pulled out of the parking garage, he turned on some soft music and rolled down the window just a bit. The cool night air felt refreshing after being stuck in meetings all day. The streets were mostly empty as he drove through the suburbs. Street lights cast long shadows across the pavement. A few people were walking their dogs, and some houses had their porch lights on. Everything seemed peaceful and normal. Robert thought about stopping to grab some dinner, but he was tired. All he wanted was to get home, maybe read for a bit, and get some sleep. At a red light, he checked his watch. It was a gift from his late father. Nothing too expensive, but full of memories. He smiled, thinking about the old man and how proud he would have been. The light turned green, and Robert continued driving, completely unaware that 2 police officers had pulled up behind him. Officers Derek Reynolds and Kyle Patterson sat in their patrol car, watching the sedan ahead of them. They had been partners for almost 5 years, and in that time, they had developed some very questionable habits. Their precinct knew about these habits, but somehow nothing ever seemed to stick. Complaints would come in, get filed away, and life would go on. Derek nudged Kyle and pointed at the car in front of them. "See that watch?" he said with a smirk. "Guy driving that old car has no business wearing something that nice. You thinking what I'm thinking?" Kyle grinned and reached for the radio. "Oh yeah, let's see what we've got here." They had done this before, many times actually. Find someone who looked out of place, pull them over, and see what happens. Sometimes they would find something, sometimes they wouldn't. But they always enjoyed the power trip, the feeling of control, the way people would get nervous and scared when those red and blue lights started flashing. Robert saw the lights in his rearview mirror and felt his heart sink just a little. He hadn't been speeding. He knew he hadn't run any red lights or done anything wrong. But he also knew, deep down in a place he wished didn't exist, that sometimes doing nothing wrong didn't matter. His hands gripped the steering wheel a bit tighter as he carefully pulled over to the side of the road. The street was quiet except for the sound of his turn signal clicking. Robert put the car in park and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. This was something he had learned long ago, something his own father had taught him. "Keep your hands visible, move slowly, be respectful," the old man had said, "even when you've done nothing wrong." It hurt Robert's heart that he still needed to remember these lessons. Here he was, one of the most powerful judges in the entire country, and he still felt that familiar anxiety creeping up his spine. He took a deep breath and waited, watching in his side mirror as 2 officers got out of their car. Derek and Kyle approached the vehicle with their flashlights out, shining them directly into Robert's face. The bright light was blinding, and Robert had to squint. He could hear their footsteps, the jingle of handcuffs and equipment on their belts. One officer went to the driver's side, while the other circled around to the passenger side, shining his light through the windows. "License and registration," Derek demanded, his voice sharp and unfriendly. There was no "good evening" or "do you know why I pulled you over?" Just a command, delivered like Robert was already guilty of something. Robert moved slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and clear. "Good evening, officer. May I ask what the reason for the stop is?" His voice was calm and measured, the same tone he used in courtrooms every day. Derek's jaw tightened. He didn't like being questioned, especially not by someone he had already decided was up to no good. "I said license and registration. You deaf or something?" Kyle tapped on the passenger window with his flashlight, making Robert jump slightly. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way, buddy. Your choice." Robert felt anger rising in his chest, but he pushed it down. Getting angry wouldn't help. Instead, he reached slowly for his wallet, narrating every movement. "I'm reaching for my wallet now. It's in my inside jacket pocket." His fingers found the leather wallet and he pulled it out carefully. Inside was his driver's license, but also his official identification card. The card that showed he was the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. The card that had his official photo, his title, and several security features that proved it was legitimate. He handed both cards to Derek through the window. "Officer, I'm Chief Justice Robert Hamilton. I believe there's been some kind of mistake here." Derek barely glanced at the cards before letting out a harsh laugh. "Yeah, sure you are. And I'm the president. Kyle, you hear this guy?" Kyle walked around to join his partner, and they both stared down at Robert with expressions that mixed amusement and contempt. "Chief Justice, huh?" Kyle said, shaking his head. "Man, we get some creative ones, but that's a new one." "Where'd you steal this car from, really?" Robert felt something cold settle in his stomach. They weren't even looking at his identification. They had already made up their minds about who he was and what this was about. He tried again, his voice still calm but firmer now. "Officers, I understand you're doing your job, but if you would just verify my credentials, you'll see I'm telling you the truth. You can call it in. Check the database." Derek tossed the ID cards back through the window and they landed in Robert's lap. "Step out of the vehicle now." "On what grounds?" Robert asked, his legal mind kicking in despite his growing concern. "On the grounds that I said so," Derek shot back. "You've got 3 seconds before this gets a lot worse for you. 1, 2. Robert knew he had a choice to make. He could refuse, stand on his rights, and probably end up in an even worse situation. Or he could comply, even though every fiber of his being knew this was wrong. He thought about his wife waiting at home. He thought about the cases on his desk. And he thought about the countless people who didn't have his education, his position, his resources, who face this exact situation every single day. With a heavy sigh, Robert opened his car door and stepped out into the night. His evening had just taken a turn he never expected, and somewhere deep inside he knew this was going to change everything. Part 2, The Unlawful Stop. The cool night air hit Robert's face as he stood beside his car. His legs felt steady, but his mind was racing. In all his years on the bench, he had seen situations like this play out in court. He had read police reports, watched body camera footage, and listened to testimony from both officers and civilians, but experiencing it himself was completely different. Derek pointed toward the front of the car with his flashlight. "Hands on the hood. Spread your legs." Robert complied, placing his palms flat against the still warm metal of his car. He could feel the heat from the engine through his dress shirt. Kyle moved behind him and Robert felt hands roughly patting down his sides, checking his pockets. The search was aggressive, more aggressive than necessary for a simple traffic stop. "What exactly am I being accused of, officers?" Robert asked, keeping his voice level. Years of courtroom experience had taught him how to stay calm under pressure, but this was testing every ounce of that training. "Suspicious activity," Kyle said from behind him. "Driving a vehicle that doesn't match your appearance. Possible stolen property. Resisting cooperation with law enforcement." Robert almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. Resisting cooperation? He had done everything they asked. But he knew better than to argue right now. "I've cooperated with everything you've asked. I showed you my identification. I'm a Chief Justice and I'm simply trying to drive home." Derek walked around to face him, shining his flashlight directly into Robert's eyes again. "You know how many times we hear stories like that? Oh, I'm somebody important. Oh, you've got the wrong guy. Save it for someone who cares. Then verify it," Robert said, a hint of frustration creeping into his voice despite his best efforts. "Call your dispatch. Check the state judicial database. My information is right there. This entire situation can be cleared up in 2 minutes." Kyle finished the pat-down and stepped back. Found a wallet with multiple credit cards. Expensive watch, cash. Guy's either a thief or a dealer. Robert's jaw clenched. Multiple credit cards because he was a responsible adult with good credit. An expensive watch because his father gave it to him before he died. Cash because he liked to tip well at restaurants. But in their eyes, these things made him a criminal. "Those credit cards have my name on them," Robert said. "The same name on the identification I showed you. Robert Hamilton. Run it through your system." Derek pulled out his radio, but instead of calling to verify Robert's identity, he did something that made Robert's blood run cold. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. We've got a suspicious individual, possible 1031. Need backup at the corner of Elm and 5th. Subject is being uncooperative." A 1031 was code for a crime in progress. Uncooperative meant potentially dangerous. Derek was escalating the situation, and he was doing it on purpose. Robert realized with growing dread that these officers had no intention of verifying who he was. They had decided what this was, and they were going to make reality fit their narrative. "I am being completely cooperative," Robert said loudly, clearly. "I have answered every question. I have followed every instruction. I am not resisting in any way." He said this not just for the officers, but for their body cameras. He knew they were recording. He knew that somewhere this footage would be reviewed. He just had to make sure he survived long enough for that to happen. Across the street, porch lights were starting to come on. Curious neighbors were peeking through curtains and stepping out onto their lawns. A few people had their phones out recording. In today's world, that was both a blessing and a curse. It meant there would be evidence, but it also meant his humiliation was being broadcast for the world to see. A young man, probably around 17 or 18, stood on the sidewalk about 30 feet away. He was black like Robert, and the look on his face was one Robert recognized immediately. It was fear mixed with understanding. This young man had probably been through something similar or knew someone who had. Their eyes met for just a second, and Robert saw his own reflection in that teenager's expression. Kyle noticed the gathering crowd and didn't like it. "Everyone back in your houses. This is official police business. Nothing to see here, but people didn't move. They stayed on their porches, phones recording, witnessing." One elderly woman called out, "Is everything all right?" "What did he do?" "Ma'am, please go inside," Derek said, his voice carrying that official tone that police use when they want compliance without question. The woman didn't go inside. Instead, she took a few steps closer. "I've lived on this street for 40 years, and I know everyone's car. That's Judge Hamilton's car. I've seen it drive by every evening for the past 6 months." Robert felt a surge of gratitude toward this stranger, but Derek just shook his head. "Ma'am, for the last time, please step back." In the distance, Robert could hear sirens. The backup Derek had called for was coming. More officers meant more complications. It meant more people who would have to admit they were wrong if this got straightened out, which meant they were less likely to admit anything at all. Robert made a decision. He would cooperate fully, document everything mentally, and trust that the truth would eventually come out. He had spent his entire career believing in the system. Now he was about to find out if that belief was justified. "Officers," he said one more time, "I'm asking you, please just verify my identity before this goes any further. I'm not who you think I am." Kyle stepped closer, his face inches from Robert's. "You're exactly who we think you are. You're someone who doesn't belong in this neighborhood. Driving a car you probably can't afford. Wearing things you probably didn't pay for. We see guys like you every single day." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Guys like you. Robert had heard those words before. Whispered in back rooms, implied in decisions. Coded in language that tried to sound neutral but never quite managed it. But hearing them now, standing here with his hands on his car while neighbors watched and phones recorded, those words cut deeper than they ever had before. 2 more police cars pulled up, their lights painting the quiet street in alternating colors of red and blue. 4 more officers got out, and Robert watched as Derek and Kyle approached them, explaining the situation in voices too low for him to hear. He saw gestures toward his car, toward him, toward the small crowd of neighbors. One of the new officers, an older man with gray hair, walked over to Robert. "Sir, I'm Sergeant Mills. Can you tell me what's happening here?" Finally, Robert thought, someone who might listen to reason. "Sergeant, my name is Robert Hamilton. I'm the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. I was driving home from work when I was pulled over. I've shown these officers my identification, but they've refused to verify it. I'm asking you to please check the judicial database. This is all a misunderstanding." Sergeant Mills studied Robert's face for a long moment. There was something in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty maybe, that gave Robert hope. But then Derek called out from behind them. "Sarge, guy's been claiming he's a judge. Won't cooperate. Keeps making up stories. We think the vehicle might be stolen." The hope in Robert's chest dimmed. Mills looked at him again, and Robert could see the decision being made. Believe the officers he worked with every day, or believe a stranger on the side of the road. It wasn't really a choice at all. "Sir, I'm going to need you to turn around and put your hands behind your back," Mills said, and Robert felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. Part 3. The arrest, Robert felt the cold metal of handcuffs click around his wrists. The sound echoed in his ears, mixing with the murmur of the growing crowd and the static from police radios. He had sent people to prison before, signed orders for arrests, upheld convictions, but he had never imagined what those handcuffs actually felt like until this moment. They were tight. Too tight. The metal bit into his skin as Derek yanked his arms back, showing no care for the 62-year-old joints that protested the rough treatment. Robert winced but didn't cry out. He wouldn't give them that satisfaction. "You're making a serious mistake," Robert said, his voice steady despite the humiliation coursing through him. "When this gets sorted out, and it will get sorted out, every single one of you will have to answer for this." Kyle laughed, actually laughed, as he guided Robert toward their patrol car. Yeah. Everyone's innocent. Everyone's somebody important. Save the threats for someone who cares, pal. The neighbors were closer now, their phones held high, recording every second. Robert could hear their voices overlapping with questions and concerns. The elderly woman who had recognized his car was on her phone, speaking urgently to someone. A middle-aged man in a bathrobe was shaking his head in disbelief. And that young teenager was still standing there, watching with wide eyes that held too much understanding for someone so young. Robert caught the teen's eye again and saw something that broke his heart. The boy was scared, not just for Robert, but because this confirmed something he already knew. That it didn't matter who you were or what you had accomplished. In moments like these, all people saw was skin color. "What's your name, son?" Robert called out to the teenager, his voice carrying across the street. The boy looked startled, glancing at the officers nervously before answering. "Thomas, sir." "Thomas, I want you to remember something," Robert said, even as Kyle tried to push him toward the car. "This isn't right. What's happening here isn't justice. And when you see things that aren't right, you speak up, you bear witness, you make sure the truth comes out. You understand me?" Thomas nodded slowly, his phone still recording. Derek grabbed Robert's shoulder roughly. "That's enough. Stop trying to incite these people." "I'm not inciting anyone," Robert replied. "I'm exercising my right to free speech." "Or are you planning to violate that constitutional right too?" The words came out sharper than he intended, but Robert was tired. Tired of being polite while being treated like a criminal. Tired of staying calm while his dignity was stripped away on a public street. Tired of a system he had devoted his life to failing so spectacularly in this moment. Sergeant Mills stepped forward, his hand raised. "Let's all just calm down here. Sir, you'll have a chance to explain everything at the station. Right now, we need to sort this out properly." "I've been trying to sort this out properly for the last 20 minutes, Robert said. "All you have to do is verify my identity. It takes 2 minutes. 1 phone call. But instead you're arresting me based on assumptions and bias." Mills's face hardened. He didn't like being challenged, especially not in front of other officers and a crowd of civilians. "Sir, you're not helping your situation." "My situation," Robert repeated, shaking his head. "My situation is that I was driving home from work. That's it. That's my crime. Driving while black in a neighborhood that apparently doesn't think I belong here." The words hung in the air. Nobody disputed them. The officers exchanged glances, but none of them denied what Robert had just said. Because they couldn't. They all knew exactly what this was. Kyle opened the back door of the patrol car, placing his hand on Robert's head to guide him inside. It was the same gesture Robert had seen in countless TV shows and news reports. He never thought he would experience it himself. The back seat smelled like sweat and fear and old vinyl. There was a metal grate separating him from the front seats. No handles on the inside of the doors. No way to escape. Robert sat back and took a deep breath, trying to center himself. Through the window, he watched Derek talking to the other officers, gesturing animatedly. He was probably explaining their version of events, building the narrative they would put in their report. Robert had read thousands of police reports in his career. He knew how they could be written to justify almost anything. The elderly neighbor was still on her phone, and now Robert could hear snippets of her conversation. "Yes, I'm absolutely certain. It's Judge Hamilton. I've seen his picture in the paper. They've arrested him. I don't know why. He was just driving. Yes, I'm recording. No, they won't listen to us." More neighbors had come out now. The whole street seemed to be awake and watching. Someone was live streaming the scene. Robert could see the phone set up on a tripod, the little red light indicating it was broadcasting. By tomorrow morning, this would be everywhere. His wife would see it. His colleagues would see it. The lawyers who appeared in his courtroom would see it. The defendants he had sentenced would see it. Everyone would see Chief Justice Robert Hamilton sitting in the back of a police car, handcuffed and arrested on his own street. Derek got into the driver's seat, and Kyle climbed in beside him. They were talking quietly, but Robert could hear pieces of their conversation. "Should have seen the look on his face when I cuffed him," Derek said with a chuckle. "Guy kept insisting he was a judge, like we're supposed to just believe him," Kyle replied. Robert leaned forward as much as the handcuffs would allow. "My identification is still in my car. You have my driver's license. You have my judicial ID. You have everything you need to verify who I am. Why won't you check?" Derek met his eyes in the rearview mirror. "Because we don't need to. We know exactly what this is. You might have fooled some people with fake IDs and a nice watch, but you're not fooling us." The certainty in his voice was chilling. Derek truly believed he was right. He had built a story in his head, and no amount of evidence was going to change it. This was about more than just a traffic stop. It was about power and control, and the assumptions people make based on nothing more than appearance. As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, Robert took one last look at his own vehicle, still parked on the side of the road with the door open and lights on. He looked at the neighbors, still watching, still recording. And he looked at Thomas, the teenager who would remember this night for the rest of his life. The sirens weren't on as they drove to the station, but the lights still flashed. Red and blue bouncing off storefronts and houses as they passed. Other drivers pulled over, staring as they went by. Robert sat in the back, hands cuffed behind him, and wondered how many innocent people had made this same journey. Kyle turned around in his seat, grinning. "So, Your Honor, how's it feel back there?" Robert didn't respond. There was nothing to say that would make a difference. These men had already decided who he was and what he deserved. The only thing that mattered now was what happened when they got to the station. "Come on, don't be like that," Kyle continued. "You were so talkative before. What happened to all those big words and threats about us answering for this?" "I don't make threats," Robert said quietly. "I make observations. And here's an observation for you. Body cameras record everything. Dispatch logs record everything. And all those phones back there recorded everything. When this is over, when the truth comes out, you won't be able to claim ignorance or mistake. You'll have to own exactly what you did tonight." The smile faded from Kyle's face. Derek's hands tightened on the steering wheel. For just a moment, Robert saw a flicker of doubt cross their expressions, but it passed quickly, replaced by defensive anger. "Is that a threat?" Derek asked. "It's reality," Robert replied, "and reality has a way of catching up with people, no matter how long they try to run from it." The rest of the drive passed in silence. The station was only 10 minutes away, but it felt like hours. Robert's wrists ached from the handcuffs. His shoulders hurt from the position his arms were forced into, but more than any physical pain, his spirit hurt. He had dedicated his entire life to justice, to fairness, to the belief that the system could work if good people made it work. And now, sitting in the back of this police car, he realized just how broken that system really was. If this could happen to him with all his power and position and education, what chance did regular people have? As they pulled into the station parking lot, Robert made himself a promise. If he got through this, when he got through this, things were going to change. This wouldn't be just another incident that got swept under the rug. This was going to mean something. Part 4. The Station House Reality. The fluorescent lights of the police station were harsh and unforgiving. Robert blinked as Derek and Kyle walked him through the back entrance, his hands still cuffed behind his back. The building smelled like old coffee, industrial cleaner, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Desperation, maybe. The booking area was mostly empty at this hour. A couple of officers sat at desks doing paperwork. A woman in the corner was crying softly while an officer tried to calm her down. Everything felt surreal, like Robert was watching a movie about someone else's life rather than living his own. Behind the main desk sat Sergeant Linda Morrison, a 25-year veteran of the force. She had short gray hair, reading glasses perched on her nose, and the tired expression of someone who had seen too much over the years. She was reviewing some paperwork when Derek and Kyle came through the door with Robert. "What do we have here?" she asked without looking up. "Suspicious individual," Derek said, his voice full of confidence. "Driving a vehicle that didn't match his appearance. Possible stolen property. Subject resisted cooperation and made false claims about his identity. Those words, false claims about his identity, made Robert's jaw tighten. He had told them the truth from the very beginning, and they had refused to believe it. Linda looked up then, and her eyes fell on Robert. For a moment her expression didn't change. Then something flickered across her face. Her eyes widened slightly. Her mouth opened just a bit. The color seemed to drain from her cheeks. What's his name?" she asked, her voice suddenly very quiet. Kyle pulled out a notebook. "Says his name is Robert Hamilton. Claims he's some kind of judge. Had fake ID and everything." Linda stood up slowly, her chair rolling backward. Her hands were shaking slightly as she reached for her computer keyboard. "Robert Hamilton," she repeated. "And you arrested him?" "Yeah," Derek said, still oblivious. "Guy was in a nice neighborhood driving an older car. Had expensive stuff. Whole thing looked off. When we tried to question him, he got defensive and started making up stories." Linda's fingers flew across the keyboard. Robert watched her face as she pulled up whatever information she was looking for. He saw the exact moment when everything clicked into place for her. Her eyes went wide, her hand came up to cover her mouth, and she looked at Robert with an expression of pure horror. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Oh my God." Derek finally seemed to notice that something was wrong. What is it?" Linda turned her computer monitor around so Derek and Kyle could see it. On the screen was Robert's official photograph from the state Supreme Court website. Chief Justice Robert Hamilton, the highest-ranking judge in the entire state, the man who had the power to change laws, influence policy, and make decisions that affected millions of people, the man standing in their booking area with handcuffs on his wrists. The silence that followed was deafening. Robert watched as the reality of what they had done washed over Derek and Kyle. Derek's face went pale. Kyle's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Neither of them said anything for what felt like an eternity. "Take the cuffs off," Linda said, her voice trembling. "Take the cuffs off right now." Kyle fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get them in the lock. When the handcuffs finally clicked open, Robert brought his arms forward and rubbed his wrists. There were red marks where the metal had dug into his skin. "Your Honor," Linda said, coming around the desk. "I am so sorry. I don't even have words for what this is." Robert looked at her and saw genuine remorse in her eyes. Unlike Derek and Kyle, who still seemed to be in shock, Linda understood the magnitude of what had happened. Not just that they had arrested someone important, but that they had arrested an innocent man based on nothing more than assumptions and prejudice. "How long have you worked here, Sergeant Morrison?" Robert asked quietly. She blinked at the question. 25 years, sir. And in those 25 years, how many times has something like this happened? How many people have been brought in here, arrested on false pretenses, treated like criminals because of how they look?" Linda opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. They both knew the answer. Too many times. Too many people who didn't have Robert's position or resources to fight back. Derek finally found his voice. "Sir, we didn't know. You have to understand, we were just doing our job." Robert turned to face him, and the look in his eyes made Derek take a step back. "Your job is to protect and serve. Your job is to uphold the law, not violate it. I told you who I was. I showed you my identification. I asked you repeatedly to verify my credentials. And you refused. Not because you couldn't, but because you had already decided what you wanted to believe. The ID could have been fake," Kyle said weakly. "We've seen fake IDs before, so you call it in," Robert said. "You verify it. That's the procedure, isn't it? But you didn't want to follow procedure because procedure might have proven you wrong." Linda had pulled out a phone and was speaking urgently into it. "Yes, sir. Yes, he's here. No, yes, I understand. Right away." She hung up and turned to Robert. "Chief Davidson is on his way. He was at dinner with his family, but he's coming immediately." Robert nodded. The police chief himself. This was escalating quickly now. In the next few hours, there would be phone calls and meetings and discussions about damage control. But none of that would change what had already happened. More officers were starting to notice the commotion. They came out of offices and break rooms, drawn by the unusual activity. Robert saw their faces change as they recognized him. Whispers spread through the station like wildfire. "Is that really Chief Justice Hamilton? What's he doing here? Oh no. Oh, this is bad." One younger officer, fresh-faced and probably right out of the academy, approached timidly. "Sir, can I get you anything? Water, coffee, a chair?" The kindness in the offer almost broke Robert's composure. After everything that had happened, this simple gesture of basic human decency nearly brought tears to his eyes. "Water would be nice, thank you." The officer practically ran to get it, returning moments later with a bottle of cold water. Robert's hands were still shaking slightly as he opened it and took a long drink. The cold water felt good on his dry throat. Derek and Kyle stood off to the side now, talking in low, urgent voices. Robert could see the panic on their faces. They were probably trying to figure out how to explain this, how to justify what they had done, but there was no justification. There was no explanation that would make this okay. Linda was pulling up files on her computer, her face growing more troubled with each screen. "Oh no," she muttered. "Oh no, 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 what is it?" Robert asked. She looked up at him, her expression grim. "Your Honor, I'm looking at the complaint history for Officers Reynolds and Patterson. Between the two of them, there have been 27 formal complaints filed. Racial profiling, excessive force, unlawful detention, filing false reports. 27, Robert repeated. And they're still on the street." Linda's silence was answer enough. The system had protected them. Union representation, lack of evidence, witnesses too scared to testify, complaints buried in paperwork. All the ways that bad officers got to keep their badges while good people suffered. The front doors burst open, and Police Chief Gerald Davidson came rushing in. He was a large man in his late 50s, still wearing the casual clothes he'd had on at dinner. His face was flushed, whether from hurrying or from stress, Robert couldn't tell. "Chief Justice Hamilton," he said, crossing the room in quick strides. "I cannot begin to express how sorry I am. This is completely unacceptable." Robert stood to face him. "Chief Davidson, I appreciate your apology, but I think we both know this goes far beyond an apology." Davidson nodded, his expression grave. "Absolutely. There will be a full investigation. These officers will be placed on administrative leave immediately, pending review. We will get to the bottom of this." "Will you?" Robert asked. "Because according to Sergeant Morrison, these officers have 27 complaints between them. 27 times that the system failed to hold them accountable. Why should this time be any different?" The question hung in the air. Davidson had no good answer because they both knew the truth. The only reason this time would be different was because it happened to someone with power, someone who couldn't be ignored or intimidated into silence. "It will be different," Davidson said firmly. "You have my word." Robert wanted to believe him. He wanted to believe that this would lead to real change, but he had been around too long, seen too much to take anyone's word at face value. "I'll be watching," Robert said quietly, "and so will a lot of other people." Outside, the first news van was pulling into the parking lot. Part 5. The immediate fallout. Within 30 minutes of Chief Davidson's arrival, the police station had transformed into controlled chaos. Officers rushed back and forth carrying files and folders. Phones rang constantly, and outside the parking lot was filling up with news vans, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metallic flowers. Robert sat in the chief's office now, a far cry from the booking area where he'd been brought in handcuffed. Someone had brought him a proper chair, fresh coffee, and kept apologizing every few minutes. But all the coffee and apologies in the world couldn't erase what had happened. Chief Davidson paced behind his desk, phone pressed to his ear. This was his fourth call in the last 20 minutes. Robert could hear snippets of the conversations. The mayor, the city attorney, someone from the governor's office. Everyone wanted to know what had happened and, more importantly, how bad the damage was going to be. "Yes, sir. I understand. We're handling it." "No, he's still here. Yes, I've apologized personally, I know. Davidson's voice was strained, the stress evident in every word. Sergeant Morrison knocked on the door and entered without waiting for permission. In her hands was a tablet, and her face looked even more troubled than before. "Chief, you need to see this." She set the tablet on the desk, and Robert could see it was cued to a video. Morrison pressed play, and suddenly Robert was watching his own arrest from multiple angles. The neighbors' cell phone videos had already been compiled into a single clip and posted online. The video showed everything. Derek and Kyle's aggressive approach, Robert's calm explanations being ignored, his repeated request for them to verify his identity, the handcuffs clicking shut, his dignified composure even as he was pushed into the patrol car. And through it all you could hear the neighbors' commentary. "That's Judge Hamilton. I know him. They're not even checking his ID. This is wrong. This is so wrong. The video had been posted less than an hour ago. It already had over 200,000 views and was climbing fast. The comment section was exploding with outrage. It's everywhere, Morrison said quietly. Local news has it. National news is picking it up. Social media is going crazy. Davidson sank into his chair, his face pale. How many views? Last I checked, approaching 300,000. And it's being shared faster than we can track. Robert watched his own arrest play out on the small screen. It was strange seeing himself from the outside. He looked smaller than he felt, older than he remembered. But his voice had been strong and clear, even in handcuffs. The body camera footage, Robert said. I want to see it. Davidson and Morrison exchanged glances. Your Honor, perhaps it would be better to... I want to see it, Robert repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. Morrison worked the tablet for a moment, pulling up the official body camera feeds from both Derek and Kyle. The footage was crystal clear, every word and action captured in high definition. Robert watched as Derek approached his car, flashlight in hand. He heard his own polite greeting. Good evening, officer. May I ask what the reason for the stop is? And then Derek's response, license and registration. You deaf or something? The disrespect was obvious from the very first words. No professional courtesy. No attempt to explain the stop. Just immediate confrontation and condescension. The video continued, showing Robert handing over his identification, clearly stating his name and position. Showing Derek barely glance at the ID before tossing it back. Showing Kyle's aggressive pat-down and sarcastic comments about Robert's story. But the worst part was what came next. Robert heard Derek's radio call to dispatch. We've got a suspicious individual. Possible 1031, need backup. Subject is being uncooperative. On the video, Robert was standing calmly with his hands on his car. He hadn't raised his voice. Hadn't made any sudden movements. Hadn't done anything that could remotely be considered uncooperative. But Derek had called him in as potentially dangerous anyway. That's filing a false report, Robert said, his voice tight with controlled anger. He lied to dispatch. He escalated the situation deliberately. Morrison nodded grimly. Yes, sir. And it's all on camera. The footage continued, showing the arrival of backup. Sergeant Mills asking what was happening. Derek explaining his version of events, painting Robert as suspicious and uncooperative. And then the handcuffs, clicking shut on Robert's wrists while neighbors watched and recorded. When the video ended, silence filled the office. Davidson looked like he might be sick. Morrison was staring at the floor, and Robert sat very still, processing what he had just witnessed. 27 complaints, he said softly. 27 times people tried to tell you these officers were a problem, and nothing happened. Your Honor, Davidson began. Don't, Robert cut him off. Don't try to explain it away or justify it. I just watched myself be arrested for absolutely no reason. I watched 2 officers lie, fabricate charges, and violate my constitutional rights. And according to your own records, they've been doing this for years. Morrison spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. I pulled their files. The complaints go back years. Racial profiling. Excessive force. 4 lawsuits settled quietly by the city. The union fought every attempt at discipline. Settled quietly, Robert repeated. How much has the city paid out? Approximately $400,000, Morrison said. Over the past 6 years, the number hit like a physical blow. $400,000 of taxpayer money, spent to cover up the actions of 2 officers who should have been fired long ago. And how many victims had there been? How many people who couldn't afford lawyers or were too scared to come forward? Davidson's phone rang again. He glanced at the screen and his face went even paler. It's the governor, he answered, putting the call on speaker. Governor Chen, thank you for calling. I have Chief Justice Hamilton here with me. Robert, came the governor's voice, tense and formal. Are you all right? Do you need medical attention? I'm fine, Governor, Robert replied. Physically, at least. I've been briefed on the situation. This is absolutely unacceptable. I want you to know that you have the full support of my office. Whatever you need, whatever resources are required, you'll have them. Robert appreciated the sentiment, but he knew what this really was. Damage control. The governor was worried about lawsuits, about public perception, about political fallout. And while those concerns were valid, they weren't Robert's priority right now. What I need, Robert said carefully, is for this to mean something. I need this to lead to real change. not just punishment for 2 officers who got caught. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Of course, absolutely. We'll form a task force, review procedures, implement new training protocols. Robert had heard promises like this before. Task forces and review boards that met a few times, wrote a report nobody read, and then quietly disbanded when the public attention moved on to something else. Governor, with all due respect, task forces aren't enough. We need structural change, independent oversight, real accountability, an end to qualified immunity that protects officers who violate people's rights. Another pause. These were big asks, the kind that challenged powerful interests and faced fierce opposition. Those are significant reforms, Robert. They would require legislative action. Then let's get the legislature moving, Robert said. Unless you'd rather wait until this happens to someone who doesn't have the platform to fight back. Someone who ends up in jail instead of your office. Someone who gets hurt or worse. The unspoken truth hung in the air. Robert had been lucky. Lucky to be who he was. Lucky to have the position he held. Lucky to have survived this encounter without physical harm. Others hadn't been so fortunate. I hear you, Governor Chen said finally. Give me 24 hours. I'll have my team draft a proposal. We'll push for comprehensive reform. After the governor hung up, the office fell silent again. Through the window, Robert could see more news vans arriving. Reporters were setting up cameras, preparing to go live. This story was growing by the minute. A young officer appeared at the door looking nervous. Chief, the mayor is here. And the city attorney. And someone from the ACLU and, well, there are a lot of people here. Davidson stood up, straightening his uniform. Your Honor, I need to address the media soon. Is there anything you'd like me to say? Robert thought about it. He could tell them to downplay it, to avoid making waves, to handle it quietly. That would be the easy path, the one that avoided conflict and controversy. But easy wasn't always right. Tell them the truth, Robert said. Tell them exactly what happened. Don't spin it, don't minimize it, own it. And then tell them what you're going to do to make sure it never happens again. Davidson nodded slowly. And Officers Reynolds and Patterson? Administrative leave pending investigation. I want their body cameras reviewed. I want their previous complaints examined. I want every single incident they've been involved in scrutinized. And I want it done by an independent investigator, not internal affairs. Done, Davidson said. As the chief left to face the gathering crowd of officials and media, Morrison lingered by the door. Your Honor, can I ask you something? Of course. How are you so calm? If this had happened to me, I'd be, I don't even know. Furious, devastated, but you're just sitting here methodically planning your next steps. Part 6. The investigation. Unfolds 48 hours after Robert's arrest. The state attorney general arrived at the police station with a team of investigators. They weren't local. They weren't connected to the department. They were brought in specifically because everyone knew that an internal investigation would never be trusted. Attorney General Patricia Wong was a no-nonsense woman in her early 50s who had built her career on prosecuting corruption and civil rights violations. She had a reputation for being thorough, relentless, and completely immune to political pressure. When she walked into the station that morning, officers literally stepped out of her way. Robert wasn't there. He had gone home after that first night, but only after giving a complete statement that had taken hours. Now he was back at work, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy while the investigation unfolded around him. But he was in constant contact with Wong's team, providing whatever information they needed. The investigation started with body camera footage, but it didn't end there. Wong's team pulled every single case that Derek Reynolds and Kyle Patterson had worked on for the past 7 years. Every arrest, every traffic stop, every incident report. They were building a complete picture of these officers' careers. What they found was disturbing. In a conference room that had been converted into an investigation headquarters, Wong stood in front of a massive board covered with photos, documents, and connecting strings like something out of a crime drama. Except this wasn't fiction. This was real people's lives being mapped out. 27 formal complaints, Wong said to her team, pointing at a section of the board. But that's just what was officially filed. We've found evidence of dozens more incidents that never made it into the system. Her lead investigator, James Park, added another photo to the board. We interviewed neighbors from the area where Justice Hamilton was arrested. Turns out Reynolds and Patterson were known for targeting minority drivers in that neighborhood. They'd find any excuse to pull people over. Broken taillight, failure to signal, driving too slow, driving too fast. It didn't matter. If you didn't look like you belonged there, you were getting stopped. Another investigator, Michelle Torres, had been reviewing traffic stop data. Over the past 3 years, Reynolds and Patterson conducted 412 traffic stops. 378 of those stops involved Black or Hispanic drivers. That's over 90%. Demographics of their patrol area? Wong asked. 43% minority. Torres replied. The numbers don't match the population. Not even close. Wong nodded grimly. Pattern in practice. This isn't about one bad night. This is systematic discrimination. But the investigation went deeper. They started reaching out to people who had been arrested by Reynolds and Patterson. Some were easy to find, their cases still in the system. Others took more work. Phone calls, door knocks, following paper trails that had gone cold. What they discovered broke Wong's heart. There was Angela Rodriguez, a teacher who had been pulled over 3 years ago while driving to her mother's house. She fit the profile. Hispanic woman in a nice neighborhood. Reynolds and Patterson had searched her car without consent, found nothing, but still gave her a ticket for a broken taillight that wasn't actually broken. She paid the fine because fighting it would have cost more than the ticket itself. There was David Chen, a software engineer stopped 2 years ago. The officers claimed he matched the description of a robbery suspect. He didn't, not even close, but they detained him for 2 hours on the side of the road, questioned him aggressively, and let him go with a warning about suspicious behavior. David filed a complaint, but it disappeared into the system and nothing ever came of it. There was Jerome Williams, a high school student who had been walking home from basketball practice. Reynolds and Patterson stopped him, questioned him, searched his backpack without permission. They found nothing because there was nothing to find, but Jerome remembered feeling scared and helpless. He never told his parents because he didn't want them to worry. The stories kept coming, each one adding another piece to the pattern. Some people had been arrested on minor charges that didn't stick. Others had just been harassed and let go. But all of them shared the same experience, being treated like criminals for doing nothing wrong. Thomas, the teenager who had witnessed Robert's arrest, came forward with his own story. He had been stopped by Reynolds and Patterson 3 weeks before the incident with Robert. They had accused him of loitering in his own neighborhood, threatened to arrest him for disorderly conduct, and only let him go when his mother came out and intervened. I thought it was just me. Thomas told the investigators, his voice quiet. I thought maybe I did something wrong or I looked suspicious or I don't know. But then I saw them do it to Judge Hamilton and I realized it wasn't me. It was them. Wong's team compiled everything into a detailed report. The statistics, the testimonies, the pattern of behavior that showed this wasn't about individual mistakes or split-second decisions. This was about 2 officers who had systematically violated people's rights for years, protected by a system that looked the other way. But there was another layer to the investigation, one that made Wong even angrier. The department's Internal Affairs Division had records of complaints against Reynolds and Patterson. Lots of them. But somehow nothing ever happened. Look at this, James Park said, pulling up files on his laptop. Complaint from 4 years ago. Racial profiling. Internal Affairs recommended a written warning. The union fought it. Case dismissed 2 years ago. Excessive force during an arrest. IA recommended a 3-day suspension. Union fought it. Officer was given additional training instead. 8 months ago. Filing a false report. IA recommended termination. The union fought it. Officer was moved to a different district. The union fought it, Wong repeated, her voice heavy with frustration. Every single time the union stepped in and protected them. It was a common story, one Wong had seen in departments across the state. Police unions were supposed to protect officers from unfair treatment, but too often they protected officers who deserved to be fired. They made it nearly impossible to hold bad cops accountable, even when the evidence was overwhelming. Michelle Torres had been digging into the financial records. The city has paid out $417,000 in settlements related to complaints against these 2 officers. 4 separate lawsuits, all settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements. The victims couldn't talk about what happened, Wong said, understanding immediately. The city paid them off and silenced them. Exactly. And because the settlements were confidential, They couldn't be used in future cases or investigations. Each incident was treated as isolated even though the pattern was obvious. Wong stood back and looked at the board, at all the lives these two officers had affected. All the people who had been victimized by abuse of power, protected by a system that valued solidarity over justice. "Here's what we're going to do," she said to her team. "We're going to document every single case, every complaint, every lawsuit, every incident. We're going to interview every victim who's willing to talk. We're going to build a case so airtight that there's no way it gets dismissed or plea bargained down to nothing." "What about the department?" James asked. "The supervisors who ignored the complaints? The union reps who fought discipline? Internal affairs that buried evidence?" Wong's expression was cold. "Them too. If they knew what was happening and did nothing, they're complicit. We're going to hold everyone accountable." Over the next 2 weeks, the investigation expanded. Federal civil rights investigators joined Wong's team. The Department of Justice opened its own inquiry into department-wide practices, and slowly, painfully, the full scope of the problem came into focus. This wasn't just about two bad officers. It was about a culture that enabled them, a system that protected them, a community that suffered because of them. Robert followed the investigation from his chambers, receiving daily updates from Wong. Each new revelation made him angrier, but also more determined. This couldn't just end with two officers being punished. The whole system needed to change. One afternoon, Wong came to Robert's office personally. She had a thick folder in her hands and a grim expression on her face. "Your Honor, I wanted you to see this before it goes public," she said, setting the folder on his desk. "We found 37 people who had similar experiences with Reynolds and Patterson. 37 that we could verify and document. There are probably more who were too scared to come forward." Robert opened the folder and began reading. Each page was a story of injustice. Each one represented someone whose rights had been violated, whose dignity had been stripped away, whose faith in the system had been broken. 37, he repeated softly. "How many of them filed complaints?" 15, Wong replied. "The other 22 never reported it. They didn't think anyone would believe them, or they were afraid of retaliation, or they just wanted to move on and forget it happened." Robert closed the folder, unable to read anymore. "And if this hadn't happened to me, if they had arrested someone without power or position or resources, this would still be going on," Wong said simply. "Reynolds and Patterson." Part 7. The Legal Reckoning. The federal courthouse was packed on the first day of the trial. Every seat in the gallery was filled, with dozens more people standing in the hallway hoping to get in. News cameras lined the steps outside, their reporters doing live broadcasts as people filed past. This wasn't just another trial. This was a referendum on police accountability, and everyone knew it. Derek Reynolds and Kyle Patterson sat at the defense table with their lawyers, both men looking far different than they had that night on the street. Gone were the confident smirks and aggressive postures. Now they looked small and worried, their expensive suits unable to hide their fear. The charges were serious. Federal civil rights violations under color of law, false imprisonment, filing false police reports, conspiracy to deprive someone of their constitutional rights. Each charge carried years of potential prison time. Their lawyers had tried to get the charges reduced or dismissed, arguing that this was a simple mistake blown out of proportion. But the evidence was overwhelming and the judge wasn't buying it. Robert sat in the gallery, not on the bench where he usually presided. Today he wasn't a judge. He was a witness, a victim, and a reminder of what this trial was really about. When he walked into the courtroom that first morning, every head turned. People whispered and pointed. Some took photos on their phones before being reminded that cameras weren't allowed inside. The prosecutor was a federal attorney named Lisa Chen, a woman who had spent 15 years handling civil rights cases. She was known for being thorough and passionate, and she had prepared for this trial like it was the most important case of her career. Because in many ways it was. "Your Honor," she said during her opening statement, "this case is about abuse of power. It's about two police officers who believed they were above the law, who believed they could target people based on nothing more than the color of their skin, who believed their badges gave them the right to violate the constitutional rights of anyone they chose." She walked the jury through what happened that night. The traffic stop with no legal justification, the refusal to verify Robert's identity, the false report to dispatch, the unlawful arrest, Every detail was laid out carefully, supported by body camera footage that played on screens throughout the courtroom. The jury watched Robert's arrest in high definition. They heard Derek's dismissive tone when Robert tried to identify himself. They saw Kyle's rough handling during the pat-down. They witnessed the fabricated radio call that labeled Robert as dangerous and uncooperative. But this isn't just about one night, Chen continued. This is about a pattern of behavior that stretched back years. A pattern of targeting minority drivers, a pattern of making up excuses to stop people, a pattern of violating rights and then lying about it. Over the next 3 weeks, Chen methodically built her case. She called witness after witness, each one telling their story of being stopped, searched, arrested, or harassed by Reynolds and Patterson. Angela Rodriguez took the stand, her hands trembling as she described being pulled over for a broken taillight that wasn't broken. David Chen testified about being detained for 2 hours because he matched a description of someone who looked nothing like him. Jerome Williams, now a college freshman, told the jury about being stopped and searched while walking home from basketball practice. Thomas, the teenager who had witnessed Robert's arrest, gave powerful testimony about his own encounter with the officers. I was just standing on my own street, he said, his voice steady despite his nerves. And they treated me like I was a criminal. Like I didn't belong in my own neighborhood. The defense lawyers tried to poke holes in the testimonies, suggesting that the witnesses were exaggerating or remembering things wrong. But there were too many of them, and their stories were too consistent. The pattern was undeniable. Then came the expert witnesses, a statistician who showed that Reynolds and Patterson's traffic stops targeted minorities at a rate far exceeding any reasonable explanation. A former police chief who testified that their actions violated every standard of professional law enforcement. A civil rights attorney who explained how qualified immunity had protected these officers for years, allowing them to continue their behavior without consequences. But the most impactful testimony came from Robert himself. When he took the stand, the courtroom went completely silent. Here was the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, the man who usually sat in judgment of others, now sitting in the witness box as a victim of crime. Chen led him through the events of that night step by step. Robert spoke clearly and calmly, his years of courtroom experience evident in every word. But beneath the calm exterior, everyone could sense the emotion. When I handed Officer Reynolds my identification, Robert testified, I clearly stated my name and position. I told him I was Chief Justice Robert Hamilton. He barely glanced at the ID before throwing it back at me. What did he say? Chen asked. He laughed. Said he'd heard that one before. Like I was lying. Like my identification meant nothing. How did that make you feel? The defense attorney objected. Relevance, Your Honor. The defendant's feelings aren't material to whether the officers broke the law. The judge, a stern woman named Barbara Mitchell, overruled. I'll allow it. The witness may answer. Robert took a moment before responding. It made me feel powerless, invisible. Like no matter what I said or did, they had already decided who I was based solely on how I looked. I've spent my entire career fighting for equal justice under the law, and in that moment I realized that all my education, all my accomplishments, all my years of service meant nothing to those officers. Several jury members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Chen showed Robert the body camera footage. Is this an accurate recording of what happened that night? Yes, Robert confirmed. They watched it together, the entire courtroom seeing Robert's arrest once again. When it got to the part where Derek called in the false report, labeling Robert as uncooperative, while the video clearly showed him standing calmly with his hands on the car, Chen paused the footage. Chief Justice Hamilton, at this moment in the video, were you being uncooperative? No. I was standing still with my hands visible exactly as I had been instructed. Yet Officer Reynolds reported you as potentially dangerous and uncooperative. Why do you think he did that? The defense attorney objected again, but Judge Mitchell allowed the question. Because, Robert said slowly, he wanted backup to validate his actions. He wanted other officers to arrive expecting trouble, which would make his decision to arrest me seem more justified. It was a preemptive cover for an unlawful arrest. The defense's cross-examination tried to suggest that Robert had been difficult or confrontational, but the body camera footage contradicted every attempt. The video didn't lie. Robert had been polite, cooperative, and calm throughout the entire encounter. When the defense attorney suggested that Reynolds and Patterson had simply made an honest mistake, Robert's response was sharp and measured. An honest mistake would have been corrected when I provided identification. An honest mistake would have involved verifying my credentials when I asked repeatedly for them to do so. What happened that night wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate choice to ignore evidence because it didn't fit their preconceived narrative. The defense also tried to bring in Reynolds and Patterson's service records, highlighting their years on the force and commendations they had received. But Chen was ready for this. Those commendations came from the same department that buried 27 complaints against these officers, she pointed out. The same department that paid out over $400,000 in settlements. Awards and commendations don't erase constitutional violations. Both Reynolds and Patterson chose not to testify in their own defense, a decision that hung heavy over the courtroom. Their lawyers argued that they didn't have to prove their innocence, that the burden was on the prosecution. But everyone knew what their silence really meant. In her closing argument, Chen stood before the jury with passion and purpose. Chief Justice Hamilton could have looked the other way, she said. He could have accepted apologies and let this go. He has the power and position to do that. But he didn't. He chose to stand here and testify not just for himself, but for every person who has been victimized by abuse of police power and didn't have the resources to fight back. She gestured toward Reynolds and Patterson. These men wore badges. They took oaths to protect and serve, but they used their authority as a weapon against the very people they were supposed to protect. They targeted individuals based on race. They filed false reports to cover their actions. They violated constitutional rights without a second thought. The defense wants you to believe this was just a mistake, but mistakes don't show patterns. Mistakes don't happen 37 times. Mistakes don't persist for years despite complaints and lawsuits and evidence. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. A deliberate, repeated choice to abuse power. Chen paused, making eye contact with each juror. Your verdict will send a message, not just to these two defendants, but to every police officer in this country. It will say whether we truly believe in equal justice under the law, or whether some people are above it. It will say whether badges grant. Part 8. The Transformation. 6 months after the trial, Robert stood in the state capitol building looking out at a packed chamber. Every seat was filled with legislators, community leaders, civil rights activists, and ordinary citizens who had come to witness something historic. The gallery was overflowing with people standing along the walls and sitting in the aisles. Today, the legislature was voting on the Equal Justice and Police Accountability Act, a comprehensive reform bill that Robert had helped draft. It represented months of work, countless meetings, and more political battles than he could count. But it was finally here. The bill was extensive. It mandated body cameras for all officers with footage automatically uploaded to independent servers, making it impossible to delete or alter recordings. It created citizen oversight boards with real power to investigate complaints and recommend discipline. It ended qualified immunity for officers who violated constitutional rights, making them personally liable in civil lawsuits. It required automatic review by state authorities whenever an officer accumulated more than 3 formal complaints. And it established a public database of police misconduct, making it impossible for problem officers to simply move to another department and start over. The police unions had fought it every step of the way. They called it anti-police. They said it would make officers afraid to do their jobs. They claimed it would lead to chaos and increased crime. But after Robert's case and the trial that followed, public opinion had shifted dramatically. People were tired of empty promises about reform. They wanted real change. Governor Chen had thrown her full support behind the bill, using Robert's case as a rallying point. The media coverage had been constant, keeping the issue in the public eye. And most importantly, the victims who had testified at the trial had become powerful advocates, telling their stories to anyone who would listen. As Robert watched the proceedings, he thought about how much had changed in just 6 months. Derek Reynolds and Kyle Patterson were serving 8-year prison sentences in a federal facility. Their appeals had been denied. Their law enforcement careers were permanently over, their names forever associated with abuse of power and racism. But the consequences had extended far beyond those 2 officers. Chief Davidson had taken early retirement, unable to withstand the pressure and criticism that followed the investigation. The entire command structure of the police department had been reorganized. 3 supervisors who had ignored complaints about Reynolds and Patterson were demoted. The head of internal affairs was fired outright. The police union had fought tooth and nail to protect everyone involved, but this time their usual tactics hadn't worked. The evidence was too clear, the public outrage too strong, the political will too determined. For once, accountability had won over solidarity. The precinct itself had undergone a complete transformation. New leadership had come in with a mandate for change. Training programs were revamped to focus on de-escalation and implicit bias. Officers were required to participate in community meetings and actually get to know the neighborhoods they served. The us versus them mentality that had poisoned the department for years was being systematically dismantled. It wasn't easy. Some officers resisted. Some quit rather than adapt. But others, the good ones who had been silenced or sidelined for years, finally had a chance to lead. Officers who believed in genuine community policing. Officers who understood that protecting people meant protecting everyone, not just some people. Robert had also filed a civil lawsuit against the city, Reynolds, and Patterson personally. His lawyers had advised him that he could win millions in damages. But Robert had other plans. When the case settled for $2 million, he donated every penny to create the Equal Justice Legal Defense Fund. The fund provided free legal representation to victims of police misconduct who couldn't afford lawyers. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The city that had paid to silence victims for years was now funding a program to help them fight back. On the floor of the legislature, the debate was winding down. Representatives from both parties had spoken, some in support, some in opposition. The police union representatives in the gallery looked grim, knowing they were about to lose this fight. Finally, the speaker called for the vote. All in favor of House Bill 847, the Equal Justice and Police Accountability Act, signify by saying aye. A chorus of voices rang out. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. A much smaller number responded. Nay. The ayes have it. The bill passes. The chamber erupted in applause and cheers. People in the gallery stood, clapping and crying. Robert felt his own eyes getting wet, though he blinked the tears back. This was what he had fought for. This was what those handcuffs on that dark night had been about. Governor Chen signed the bill into law that same afternoon in a ceremony attended by hundreds. She invited Robert to stand beside her as she put pen to paper, and she made sure the cameras captured the moment. This law exists because Chief Justice Hamilton had the courage to turn his pain into purpose, she said during her speech, because he refused to let what happened to him be swept under the rug. Because he believed that justice isn't just something we talk about, it's something we do. After the ceremony, Robert was surrounded by people wanting to shake his hand and take photos. Among them was Angela Rodriguez, the teacher who had been stopped for a fake broken taillight. She had become one of the most vocal advocates for reform, speaking at rallies and writing op-eds about her experience. We did it, she said, hugging Robert tightly. We actually did it. You did it, Robert corrected. All of you who came forward, who testified, who refused to be silenced. This is your victory. Thomas was there too, the teenager who had witnessed Robert's arrest. He had grown in the past 6 months, not just physically, but in confidence and purpose. He approached Robert with a nervous smile. Chief Justice Hamilton, I wanted to tell you something. What's that, Thomas? I applied to college. I got accepted. I'm going to study criminal justice. He paused, then added, I want to be a lawyer. I want to help people the way you helped us. Robert felt his throat tighten with emotion. That's wonderful, Thomas. That's exactly what we need. People who understand the system from both sides. People who know what it's like to be on the receiving end of injustice. I keep thinking about what you said that night. About bearing witness. About speaking up when things aren't right. I want to spend my life doing that. Robert gripped the young man's shoulder. Then you will. And you'll be great at it. Over the following months, the effects of the new law began to ripple through the state. Police departments updated their policies. Officers who had multiple complaints were flagged for review, and some were quietly pushed out of law enforcement. The citizen oversight boards began their work, bringing transparency to a system that had operated in shadows for too long. It wasn't perfect. There was resistance and pushback, Some officers complained that they were being second-guessed on every decision. Some departments tried to find loopholes in the new requirements. But the foundation had been laid, and slowly, things began to change. Other states started looking at similar legislation. Robert found himself traveling the country, speaking to legislators and community groups about what had happened and why reform was necessary. His story had become a catalyst for a national conversation about police accountability. But perhaps the most meaningful change happened in that neighborhood where he had been arrested. The community there had organized, forming a citizens group that monitored police activity and documented concerns. They held monthly meetings where residents could share their experiences and police could listen. The elderly woman who had recognized Robert's car that night, whose name he learned was Catherine Williams, had become the group's leader. She ran the meetings with no-nonsense efficiency, making sure both sides were heard but holding everyone accountable to the truth. At one of these meetings, Robert returned as a guest speaker. The room was packed with people of all ages and backgrounds. Some were skeptical of police. Some were officers trying to rebuild trust. All of them were there because they believed things could be better. "What happened to me shouldn't have happened to anyone," Robert told the crowd. "But it happens every day to people who don't have my resources or platform. People who are afraid to speak up. People who don't think anyone will listen. That's why this work matters. That's why we can't give up even when it's hard." A young officer raised his hand. He looked barely out of the academy, fresh-faced and earnest. "Chief Justice, sir, how do we rebuild trust? How do we show people that not all of us are like those two officers?" Robert considered the question carefully. "You rebuild trust one interaction at a time. You show up with humility instead of arrogance. You listen instead of just talking. You admit when you're wrong instead of covering it up. And most importantly, you hold your fellow officers accountable. Because the thin blue line isn't supposed to protect bad cops. It's supposed to protect communities." The officer nodded, taking in the words. An older black man stood up, anger evident in his voice. "How do we know this isn't just temporary? How do we know that in a year or two, when the cameras aren't watching, things won't go back to how they were?"